we'll go ahead and kick off. And in the meantime, I always like to start, anybody on the call who's not in DC, what is the weather like where you are? Oh, B, are you in DC?
Yes, I know. I am in dreary and cold Ohio.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
I was hoping you would say, I'm in Palm Beach, it's
No.
wonderful. I especially like to do that when I'm on calls with the state associations, the CSBA, that group that I lead, that's all of our state biotech associations. And invariably, the gentleman who leads Puerto Rico bio is always like, oh, it's 82 and sunny. I'm like, okay, it's December. Lucky you. So excellent. All right. Well, this is great. Getting lots of folks on. Well, we'll go ahead and get started because we have a lot to cover today and a really exciting group of folks here with us. As always, we like to kick off our coffee chat sessions with an introduction to a new CEO to our community so that you all can welcome that person. Before that, I just wanted to say thank you. And it was so good to see so many of you at our reception last week, for those of you who were able to be there in DC. It's such a great way to kick off the year. And I think we will do that every year rather than jamming ourselves into a December calendar, but really working to beat the blues that come in January. So with that, Jet, can I ask you to introduce Ms. Lee?
Yeah, it would be my pleasure. B is also known as Bernice Martin Lee. She is our CEO spotlight today, and I just want to give a few brief words. We are going to post her full bio in the chat, but I just wanted to say how wonderful it is to have you. So she is just joined Epilepsy Foundation as their new CEO in July of last year. So I say fairly new because we try to, get people on as they start and with schedules and everything. So we're excited to have her come. She B brings 25 years of experience in nonprofit management and in the healthcare sector. And before stepping into her current role, she was distinguished herself as a senior philanthropy advisor at Ohio Health and still is in wonderful Ohio, correct? And I think
Yes.
I'll let you take it over from there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm so glad to be with the group this morning. Thank you for the invitation to join you. As stated, I joined the organization in July of 2023, and I joined the organization mainly because I am an individual living with epilepsy. And working in the healthcare space, my focus was health equity. And I felt that this was an opportunity, I believe that this was an opportunity to bring my lived experience and my professional expertise together to move the needle on health equity for the Epilepsy Foundation. So with that, coming to the organization, we have established 3 priorities. Our highest being equity, second, improving health outcomes, and then innovation. And I'd like to just take a moment to talk about those 3 priorities and how we're addressing those. So innovation, we believe that our goal for the Epilepsy Foundation is to bring new treatments to the market in a time that matters for our patients. So we focus on young inventors and innovators in the space and helping them to design new treatments, including devices to bring to market. And we do that through our Shark Tank program, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which will be held actually in the next in September. We'll be awarding $200,000 to 1 or 2 innovators in the space that bring forward an idea that moves the needle. And then secondly, we're introducing a new program, Patient Boot Camp, in September. And our goal with Patient Boot Camp is to marry the regulations and guidelines from FDA and our pharma partners with patients who are interested in trials. So we will be providing a patient boot camp that will educate our patients on the clinical process, hopefully engaging them further in the trial process. Why? Because we recognize from our epilepsy centers in 2001, our epilepsy centers were producing 10 patients per trial. We are now down to 1.7, which means we are bringing treatments to market in a much slower pace than we have prior. So it's important to us that we educate our patients so they can become part of the process. But more importantly, again, viewing everything through the equity lens, we want to make sure we are bringing forward diverse candidates for these trials. We know that the FDA has stipulated that trials must have diverse cohorts, and we want to help with that. So we are really focused on bringing forward those communities that have been underrepresented in trials and making sure they are educated about the process. You know, as an African-American leader, I understand, particularly for communities of color, we are facing the Tuskegee syndrome. And we want to move the needle from our communities believing that those are experiments to trials. And these are positive opportunities for our communities. Secondly, as we talk about improving health outcomes, we continue to do our work. This is a pillar of our work. But through our ELLIS program, which involves 16 enrolled epilepsy centers to help raise the quality of care, we are continuing to make sure that our patients have an opportunity to be a part of programs that really provide wraparound care for them and truly address all of the issues, both psychosocial and health, that come with living with epilepsy. So we are committed to improving the quality of life. And then lastly, of course, we are focused on equity. And when we say equity, we say it in the widest lens. We want to make sure that people are able to have access and also high levels of care, as well as the resources they need to thrive. Right now, in the epilepsy space, there isn't a standard of care like we have in the spaces of diabetes, hypertension, and others, and we want to bring that to the space. So we are committed to these three priorities as we move forward, and we really look forward to partnering with all of you to make them happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful, and such a great perspective that you bring, and the leading in on equity. I know we have a lot of companies here. Our coffee chat audience is made up of our patient advocacy community, but also the patient advocacy professional within our member companies. So I know a lot of folks here work in the epilepsy space, the rare epilepsies, and a number of areas. So thank you so much. We'll make sure that your contact information is shared so that folks can reach out to you. So let's get started with our panel conversation, talking about the rare pediatric disease, RPD, priority review voucher, RPD, PRV, because we are in Washington, DC, where we love acronyms, just love them. PLA, three-letter acronyms. We're going to kick off. We have four wonderful speakers today, and we're going to talk through a couple of different areas. AJ Allen has joined us, and AJ and I worked together for almost 20 years at Eli Lilly. He led Lilly's pediatric research clinical development program from start to finish, and all of the pediatric plans that were required by the agency, PRIA, BPCA, and has been a member of lots of other acronym thought leader organizations. In particular, AJ is now with iAct for Children. He'll tell us a little bit about that. And then AJ, if you could kind of talk a little bit about, from an innovator perspective, the PPRV and sort of the mechanics of that. So welcome, AJ.
Helps if I turn off the mute function. So I'm currently the Chief Medical Officer for IAC, as Michelle noted. IAC is a nonprofit 501c3 that is located in Maryland, and we actually have a virtual office, so many of us are located in other locations as well. I'm actually in Indianapolis. We are a public nonprofit, and our focus is on trying to advance pediatric drug development. In part, what we do is we work with sponsors to provide them advice on their pediatric plans using a panel experts that we can draw from. In addition, we have a pediatric trials network that is multi-specialty. It really consists of about 70 institutions in the United States that are multi-specialty. So they have a number of different specialties located within them: oncology, cardiovascular, GI, and so forth. And most of these are children's hospitals or the networks associated with children's hospitals, since that's where you typically have that sort of multi-specialty group. And what we do is we can place trials across a wide variety of specialties into this network for conducting research programs. And the idea is that this is a way to have really a network that is high quality, has ongoing training and education programs for folks in the network, and that can readily meet the needs of companies that are trying to do pediatric studies. In addition, we have a number of webinars that we do throughout the year and other sorts of activities that are also focused on that. And we interact with the FDA. Our focus is on pediatric drug development. We do work with sponsors, but really our main mission is to try and help kids through the development of new drugs. And in that connection, I think the PPRV is an interesting program that has been around now for over 10 years. It was first created in 2012 by the Creating Hope Act. And there's been a couple of renewals since then. In the process of those renewals, there's been some adjustment in terms of the procedures and the definitions. But as it is today, the process works along these lines. A company that's developing a drug for a rare pediatric disease, and by that what's meant is a disease where it's serious, maybe life-threatening, and most of the children or most of the individuals who are affected by those serious and life-threatening aspects of the disease are children, or in the pediatric age range from 0 to 18. If a company is developing a drug in that space, they first would go to the FDA and would apply for a rare pediatric disease designation with that indication. And that's really, as much as anything, a epidemiologic exercise of providing the data out there about how common is this condition overall, how common is it in the pediatric population. Does this really qualify as a disease where the majority of the patients that have severe outcomes associated with it, whether it's death or significant morbidity, that those patients are children or are in the pediatric range. And then after you've got that designation, when the company gets to the point where they actually put in their application for a new drug or for a biologic, at that point they would it goes through the normal review process, and if they do get that approval, then they would qualify for the pediatric PPRV. One of the caveats with that, though, is that the only indication where that's possible is the first indication. So it has to be that the first indication is for that rare pediatric disease that you have already had a designation from the FDA on. And that, so it can't be that you first go after a blockbuster and then later come in with the application for the rare pediatric disease. That's an important consideration. And part of that is to try and stimulate the development of these compounds and get the indications early on that benefit children and others with rare diseases. So that's kind of a quick overview of how the program works. It's has actually been fairly successful. A lot of the benefit of it comes from the fact that the vouchers that are obtained can be sold by the companies that are developing them. In many cases, those are small biotechs. So when they sell that voucher to another company, they get an infusion of cash, which for many of those small biotechs is really critical to their ongoing research programs and such. And the other aspect of this is that it's not without some risk or some need to really have a high quality program. Because just because you have a voucher and you apply it, and the voucher allows for a 6-month review of a program that typically would be reviewed in 10 months, doesn't necessarily mean that that drug will be approved under the voucher. And there is an application fee with the voucher. If you do pay that application fee and apply it to another new drug application, you can get this earlier review, but you may at the end of that time, if it's not a high quality package for the new drug, you may end up with a situation where you're told just 4 months earlier than you would have been told anyway, hey, you need to do additional studies or things like that. So it's worth keeping that in mind as part of this. And there are situations where that has occurred, and so it's a very real issue. But these vouchers can be traded in a situation where there's a close horse race between two drugs becoming approved. It can cause one drug to essentially leapfrog the other potentially, which has significant value to companies, enough that currently these vouchers are trading at about somewhere around $80 million. Although, it's worth noting they did trade as high as about 360 million. So that value has come down a little bit as more of the vouchers are available. But that market is important in terms of making these an incentive, particularly for the small companies that don't necessarily have a lot of other immediate resources. And it's a different sort of incentive than with BPCA, which is only applies really if you have the drug approved and it stays on the market and it has some value at the end of however many years to the patent life. This is something that companies can get a much more immediate incentive from. So I'll pass it along.
Thanks, AJ. Yeah, that's so important. And I think where some folks, where I know when I was kind of brushing up on the PPRV, it's easy to get confused. Is really the incentive to a small biotech in particular, or any company, really the prospect of potentially having a voucher and then being able to sell it to build capital for your next clinical development program is often sort of we don't focus a lot on that, but that's really the opportunity. Companies that might not have been in rare pediatric disease have now an incentive to go into it because of the opportunity at the end of that. So thank you so much, and those are all important considerations from a company perspective. So we'll turn it over. Maynard Fries, we posted everybody's bio in the chat, but Vice President for Policy and Advocacy at Pure SMA, and would love to hear from you from a patient perspective, and then we'll turn it over to EveryLife and North. So tell us, kind of walk us through your presentation here.
Great, thanks, Michelle. So I did pull together some slides. Hopefully you're able to see those. I'm going to be really describing this from the patient perspective, excuse me, how the pediatric disease voucher program and similar policies have really helped to spur drug development for SMA and other rare disease patients. Next slide. Actually, sorry, but back to the other side. So I'm going to first give you some background first on SMA and Cure SMA. Many of you may know this, but SMA is a rare neuromuscular disease. It weakens the muscles used for everyday living activities such as walking, swallowing, lifting your arms. And I work for Cure SMA, which is the national organization that represents individuals with SMA and their families. Our mission is to cure SMA, which we were founded 40 years ago. That was a really ambitious goal, and we're moving in that direction. The SMA community, as I mentioned, has benefited from investments at the NIH, as well as policies such as the Pediatric Voucher Program. Together, I believe that these have helped to spur drug development in this area. And so a big thank you to all of you who have helped to work on these policies, and also to those of you who continue to advocate for the rare disease community. Now the next slide, please. So I wanted to just kind of give you a summary of where SMA is, both in the past and our current landscape here. So on the left, you will see the before snapshot, which is around 2012 when the pediatric voucher program was authorized by Congress. At that time in the SMA space, SMA was the leading genetic cause of infant death. Babies born with the most common form, known as SMA type 1, often died before reaching their second birthday. Others in the SMA community suffered debilitating muscle weakness that limited their mobility and independence. My organization's focus at that time was in raising awareness, providing community support, building clinical trial capacity, and supporting further research. I should let you know that at this time, 12 years ago, researchers had identified the cause of SMA, a faulty survivor motor neuron gene, and had identified a possible solution for targeting this backup gene to boost protein levels for the survival of motor neurons. On the right, the after snapshot shows where we are today. As it says, we now have 3 FDA-approved treatments that are improving the lives of children and adults with SMA, about 70% of whom in the US are on a SMA treatment. The treatments, I should point out, do not cure the disease, but they are very effective at slowing or stopping future disease progression. The improvements that are most dramatic are in babies who are born and diagnosed through newborn screening and then receive treatment before the degeneration begins. To applaud one of our great accomplishments, just this month, we reached a significant milestone in newborn screening. Now all 50 states are screening for SMA in their newborns, something that we've been working on for many years. Today, our focus is really on developing new treatments that can be taken in combination with our existing treatments to address the unmet needs of adults and older children with SMA. This group of people who were born after treatments and early diagnosis represents the largest segment of the SMA population. Also, as it indicates, we're focused in on advocacy and developing an evidence-based standard of care. Next slide, please. So there are, excuse me, there are several factors that have contributed to our current success. The drug development incentives and new drug pathways at the FDA have played a factor, of course. All 3 SMA drugs received priority review, as well as fast track and orphan drug designations. In addition, sponsors did receive the rare pediatric disease vouchers that we were talking about today upon their FDA approval. We have no doubt that these pathways have certainly helped grow interest and engagement in the SMA field. While SMA treatments received fast track designation and priority review, I should point out that the research followed standard clinical trial processes, for example, using a placebo control group and standard outcome measurements. This structure helped to produce clear and strong data on treatment benefits and impact, which resulted in broad FDA labels, and then so far has been pretty strong treatment coverage for our population. None of this would have been possible without the SMA community themselves. Individuals with SMA and their families have been super active from the very beginning. They've been sharing their stories, identifying the need, raising research money, participating in clinical trials, and advocating at legislative meetings. This community really is remarkable in helping each other and in paying it forward for the next generation. Finally, our organization recognized early on the importance of external stakeholders to accomplish our treatment goals. We met with researchers in industry, hosted listening sessions with the FDA, where we shared patient data and stories. We invited officials to attend our conferences and arranged for SMA community members to participate in their meetings. These ongoing partnerships have produced strong results for our community. Next slide, which is also the last slide. While we are considered a research success story, our journey continues. As I mentioned, none of the current treatments represent a cure. there continues to be significant unmet needs for the SMA community, particularly related to reducing fatigue and restoring motor function and muscle loss. Of course, new development in drugs is a really big top priority. As this slide shows, we are making some progress in this area. We have a very active drug pipeline with more drugs in pipeline than ever before in our 40-year history. And of course, we welcome new partners all the time to help us meet the needs of the SMA community. As a side note, there just happens to be a New York Times opinion piece in the paper today talking about SMA gene therapy and the continued unmet needs of those who don't benefit from gene therapy because they kind of aged out of that process. Our past success and our strong future can, of course, be attributed to policies and pathways such as the Pediatric Voucher program that have incentivized research and development in rare diseases. Certainly important that these policies continue to be available and that they are strengthened so that organizations like ours can continue to meet the needs of the people that we serve. So that's my presentation, and happy to answer any questions during the Q&A time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's such an incredible story. I think the before and after slide in particular really illustrates the progress we can make together. So thank you so much for that. So I'll turn it over to Jamie Sullivan, who I think probably everybody here knows, but if you don't know, she is a rock star with Every Life Foundation, and whose title I know that I'll mess up if I try to remember it, we'll start with you, have you chat a little bit about sort of the history, and then hand it over to Karen Heltzer, who is a rock star with Nord, and talk a little bit. You can tell that I'm over age 50 because nobody in their like cool years would ever say rock star, but that's me. So anyway, who will talk to us about some of the early challenges with this reauthorization. So Jamie, I'll hand it to you.
Great, thanks, Michelle. So gonna talk just a little bit about some of the history of the past reauthorizations, and then lead into Karen talking about the early stages of this reauthorization. And I think it's important that, you know, while we think that the importance of reauthorizing the PRV program is not debatable, there are many that question it, and so it's really important to get to the root of those reasons, you know, why some have questioned the importance of reauthorizing this program. And I think, you know, it really comes down to a couple things, that some of the core reasons why the PRV was created is also lead to some of those questions that make it easy to challenge the need. You know, first, it was created originally in part because it doesn't cost taxpayer money. You know, it's an incentive that is really additive to those that we know in the Orphan Drug Act. But that sale, which is exactly, you know, the incentive, is easy to create misunderstandings about and easy to create talking points about and it's really just about a misunderstanding of the fundamental nature of what the incentive is. And then, you know, it really targets a relatively small population of some of the most hard to treat and difficult to study populations. And as a result, and it's designed to be influencing early decision making. So for all of those reasons, the impact of the PRV program takes time to show and takes time to measure. And this program was only reauthorized, it was only created in 2012. So we're on year 12 now. And if you think about the time frame of developing drugs for this very difficult population with all unmet need, these are drugs that are that qualify for the PRV or the first use. You know, it takes a lot of time. And unfortunately, what we have as the most sort of official analysis of the program came in 2019. And that just was less than 10 years after the program was created. And that's via a GAO report. And it questioned, there haven't been that many. What's the impact? How are we going to know? And I think that we've started to answer those questions over the last few years. So I'm really encouraged by the progress and the data that's out there from the last few years. But what has that led to? So taking a step back, the last reauthorization of the program occurred on December 27th, 2020. That was a few months after the program was set to expire originally. And we saw at that time, Congress, the Senate was under Republican control. In the Help Committee, it was chaired by Lamar Alexander. And in the House, there was Democrat control, and the Energy and Commerce Committee, where much of this conversation has to occur, was led by Representative Pallone. And what originally, and leading into the last reauthorization, there was a lot of conversation about wanting to make this program permanent. I think with any incentive like this, it is desirable for it to be permanent. The tropical disease PRV, which was the original one, doesn't sunset. So there was a lot of conversations around how can we make that happen for the rare pediatric PRV as well. The process looked a little different than I think it will likely look this year, in that we really had strong bipartisan support. The House bill went through fairly regular order, meaning it was marked up in the E&C committee. It was had really strong bipartisan support. It was led by Mr. Butterfield, who is no longer in Congress, but he was the co-chair of the Rare Disease Caucus, and Mr. McCall, who is getting back involved in this go-around. And the House actually passed their bill on September 30th in 2020 and sent it over to the Senate. So in the Senate, there were a lot more conversations, and unfortunately, we're not able to have a final passage in the Senate as a standalone bill. However, thankfully, when it became clear that we were reaching the date of expiration of September 30th, it also coincided, of course, with the expiration of our fiscal year funding. And as a result, the Congress had to pass a continuing resolution. And as part of that continuing resolution, as often happens with programs that expire at the end of a fiscal year, the continuing resolution included a short-term extension of the PRV program as well. There were 5 total extensions that year, and so thankfully each one had that short-term extension for PRVs, until ultimately a really robust advocacy effort from this community led to the program being reauthorized for 4 years as part of the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Consolidation Appropriations Act of 2020. Mouthful. I think we were all in a little bit of a daze at that point in 2020, but it was a victory to celebrate, even though it was not able to be reauthorized permanently, in part because I think there was conversations around wanting to see more impact data, and for all of the concerns that Karen's going to talk about, they were not willing to reauthorize it permanently, but we were grateful at the time that it was reauthorized, and we are really starting to gear up. PRVs are undoubtedly part of the orphan incentives puzzle, and the more pieces of that puzzle that go missing, the harder environments that we all are going to face in order to bring treatments to those that we know are desperately in need of them. So we're ready to act. We've been working with all of you, we'll be collaboratively working to make this case show the impact. And one thing, just if you were new to the PRV and looking for more information, the basics of how it works, we put up our first policy primer on our RDLA website that has the basics of the program, and we'll be looking to work with all of you to coordinate, what does the community need to see to take action and advocate for the reauthorization? Because as Karen will talk about, it's going to be a bit of a rough road.
Excellent. So with that, Karen, why don't you share with us this exciting path forward?
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. And Jamie, thank you so much for kind of setting us up for the 8 month ahead. So we know that September 30th is going to be here faster than we all would like. And we know with all the quibbles that Jamie talked about with the last reauthorization, we know that there were unintended consequences on FDA where the number of rare pediatric disease designation requests really skyrocketed in the month leading up to when the program was expected to sunset. And that really had unintended consequences just because there is limited staff at FDA. And we want to try and avoid that from happening again. Plus, I think there is a real risk that the program might lapse this year. As Jamie already alluded to, the pediatric priority review vouchers are not the only priority review vouchers out there. And the more or less companion review voucher program for neglected tropical diseases actually lapsed recently. So there is precedent. There are some minor details and differences in how congressional offices see the two programs, but I do think it is not great news that ultimately that priority review program lapsed and is currently not authorized. So over the last couple of weeks and months, we at NORD have really tried to understand what are the most effective arguments we can make in order to try to make set us all up for a timely reauthorization. So we've spent a lot of time talking to key decision makers in Congress. And I think what we heard were really concerns around three key issues. The first issue is around this question that Jamie already alluded to. Is the priority review voucher program actually spurring new research into pediatric diseases, or is this just rewarding research that would have happened already? And I think a lot of that is motivated by some academic papers and GAO reports that have come out over the years that really fail to find a direct link between the pediatric review voucher program and an increase in approvals. Now, as Jamie said, drug development, in particular in the rare disease space, takes time. And at the time when these reviews were done, there hadn't been enough time to actually expect new programs to start, thanks to the review voucher program, and then lead to approvals. And there were actually asterisks in these papers and reports that made that pretty clear. But being in DC, nobody reads the fine print. So one of the things that we are trying to do is redo some of these analyses. If you look at some of the academic papers, you actually did see some increase in early pipeline studies for pediatric rare disease drug development. And so I do think that if we look back at the data, we can make a pretty compelling argument that yes, this program actually has spurred new research into rare pediatric diseases. And I think this morning with SMA, we already heard a really compelling story about how this has revolutionized care for patients and families. The second big bucket of questions that we get more often than we care with key officers is around what are the unintended impacts on FDA. Understanding FDA has limited staff, and there's really this concern around the second drug, as AJ so nicely explained. The review voucher would allow a drug that otherwise would not qualify for priority review to kind of skip the line. And we know that there is an increased staffing requirement on the FDA side. Now, there are higher user fees that are associated with using the priority review pathway that anybody who uses the priority review voucher has to pay. So it's not real, so that offsets things a bit, but FDA in the past has been quite outspoken about their concerns that this might limit their ability to bring other drugs to market quickly that would qualify for priority review, that would arguably address a more dire unmet need. Again, looking at the number of priority review vouchers that have been used year over year over the last several years. It's really small fraction of new drug applications and biological license applications that FDA deals with on an annual basis. So I'm not sure that this is a particularly compelling argument, but it's definitely one that we've heard a lot as we have had these initial conversations with Congress, and one that I think we will need to address as effectively as possible. And then the third bucket of concerns is around drug pricing impacts, really. Again, not necessarily thinking about the first drug, but thinking about the second drug that might come to market more quickly, in particular if that is a blockbuster drug. There are some questions and concerns around what that might do to the broader market and whether that has a chance of rising prices. I'm not an economist by training. I've talked to a number of economists over the last several weeks, and I think there are some good economic arguments to make that that is not a realistic concern, but it's definitely another concern that we've heard on Capitol Hill quite a bit, in particular given the larger discussions around the Inflation Reduction Act and drug pricing in general. And so I think there is some concern that this reauthorization might somehow get mixed in and tied up in some of those larger conversations. So where we are right now is we're trying to assemble a coalition of the willing. We're trying to reanalyze the data, compile some of the key stories, and really qualitative information on how the priority review voucher program has helped patients and companies that, in particular, small biotech companies that are desperately trying to bring these products to market. And then, as Jamie said, I think it'll be really important for all of us to coordinate and make sure that we work together so that we have aligned messages and so that we can hopefully move towards a timely reauthorization. I will put my contact information in the chat, and Michelle knows how to reach out to me. If this is of concern to you, if you want to be engaged, please reach out and we'll figure out over the next couple of weeks what the best way to move forward is as a coalition.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And yes, I know how to reach Karen. I know where she lives. I joke, we're neighbors. We live in the same neighborhood. So Karen, the second point that you raised, or the question, or the unintended impact on FDA is interesting, because there was this bolus of applications that came in for but that's a good problem to have, right? I mean, isn't that kind of what from a rare disease perspective, the community wanted?
Well, timing matters. So my understanding is that it's not that the prospect of the rare disease pediatric review voucher program going away led to more companies filing for their designation. It's that they all filed at the same time. So you had the spike before the reauthorization lapsed, and then you had the lull afterwards, which again just makes it harder for FDA to do, or for RPD to do all of the other things that they have to do.
So thanks so much for that. So with that, I'll open if there are questions or comments folks want to make, and we'll explore this a little bit more. Come on, I know you have questions. People have thoughts.
Michelle, I'll go. I'm just wondering if any of the wonderful speakers, thank you so much, this was so informative, can add a little bit more comparison to the tropical disease pediatric priority review vouchers and the medical countermeasures in terms of how they've been measured as being successful or not, and what we might be looking for to make the case that a newer program is actually generating the results we want to see.
I can start, but hope everybody else will chime in. This is an excellent question. Thank you, Amy. I think the first thing we all have to keep in mind that to some extent there's some competition between the different programs. So as Jamie said, the neglected tropical disease program was the initial one that was created. But if you look over the last several years, the largest number of vouchers that were awarded were for pediatric. And because these vouchers are traded on a market, you do have these market forces where the more review vouchers are available for sale, the lower the prices, and we've seen some fluctuation in prices. So there certainly has been some concern with the last reauthorization around the unintended consequences of the other two programs on neglected tropical diseases. And there were some tweaks made to try to align at least the programs as much as possible, understanding that when the neglected tropical disease program initially was put in place, there were more restrictions on the vouchers than for the other two programs, which put them in kind of a worse position. For the medical countermeasures one, the big differentiation that we hear on Capitol Hill is kind of the surrounding incentives and how important the incentives for the review vouchers are compared to other countermeasure incentives. So that's the big distinction there, why offices might be looking more favorably on the pediatric priority review voucher ones than on the countermeasure ones. I think the numbers are just smaller for the other two. So I'm not sure that we have a ton of strong success stories. I would love from others if you've heard of any success stories.
You know, I think part of it is that, as was alluded to with the medical countermeasures vouchers, that, you know, we're starting to see some differences in terms of the business models around how different drugs, different approaches come into play. And part of that, you know, is going to be very relevant to the rare disease space, because there's been changes proposed by CMS, for example, on how to reimburse for things like gene and cell therapies that are often going to be relevant to the rare disease space. So I think some of those come into play more. We also have the post-pandemic world where we had the situation that there was a different model that was used to encourage development of vaccines and treatments for the pandemic, and that also is playing into this. So I think in some respects the voucher program is very relevant, kind of to sort of the traditional model of diseases that are out there that are ongoing, and it needs to be viewed in that context. It's right for this space, but it may not be right for other spaces.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that is that, so I tried to be pretty general in my presentation because it's really hard to pinpoint exactly how the 3 treatments that we were successful in SMA can be, circled back to a very specific policy. We believe that it's a toolkit analogy where the more tools in the toolkit, the more incentive for the companies, and the more likelihood that we're going to have success in the patient community. I will say, if you're a parent and you're getting the news that your child has SMA back in 2012, and that take your loved one home, and likely they will only live to be 2 years old, you don't care what that voucher program is called or what the actual policy is. You just want something yesterday to help that kid. And so I know obviously Congress doesn't will want to evaluate these programs individually, but from a patient perspective, we're all about access to treatments, and access to treatment requires development, and these are all tools that are helpful in the development. We keep it very general because we can't ourselves pinpoint it exactly to one particular authority or one particular policy or one particular research funding.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think when we were having conversations, when there were proposals on the table to cut the orphan drug tax credit, we got a lot of questions about, well, what specific, like how specifically will this proposal impact rare disease development in terms of, what percentage of the incentives is it? How will it, there's no one-to-one, relationship. And we found that in all of our conversations around incentives, that it is a puzzle. Every rare disease group or type, might need a different combination of pieces in order to incentivize that development. And so I think it is really hard to make comparisons across programs, but Amy, I think you brought up a good point for us to look and see what some of those criticisms or metrics of evaluation have been, and if there is some comparison we can make.
Excellent, thank you. And we have a question in the chat from Raisa. Is the program related to NTDs, a global program, or is it just limited to specific regions? And I'm going to surmise that it's regions under the jurisdiction of the FDA, since it's an FDA program, but just I'll ask FDA experts to weigh in.
Yeah, similar to the pediatric review voucher program, it's for new drug applications and license applications that are filed with FDA for market authorization.
Thank you for that. AJ, earlier you mentioned PREA, and a lot of us haven't thought about BPCA or PREA or what they stand for since 2012. So your website has some really excellent primers on all of these things, but do you mind talking just a little bit about PREA to explain the context for folks?
Sure. So there are really two, actually, when you think about pediatric drug development, there are really three pieces of legislation that become very important. One of them is related to the orphan drug space. And actually, there's several things there: pediatric priority review vouchers, Orphan Drug Act, which have been mentioned. A lot of people forget that those are primarily dealing with pediatrics, because rare diseases are primarily pediatric conditions, and that's an important thing to remember. But in terms of specifically dealing with pediatrics, there are two major pieces of legislation. One is the Best Pharmaceutical for Children Act, or BPCA, and the second one is the Pediatric Research Equity Act, or PREA. They're often referred to by FDA as the carrot and the stick. The carrot with BPCA is 6 months of additional pediatric patent exclusivity at the end of the patent life. That is an optional program. Companies have to propose a pediatric program and get a written request from FDA in order to pursue that 6 months of exclusivity. And recently there's been some guidance from FDA where they're really looking at that to be additional indications beyond the original indications that the company pursued with adults. PREA is kind of the partner with BPCA, and it addresses those conditions that the drug was originally approved for in adults. So, for example, I'm a child psychiatrist. Drugs that are approved for depression or anxiety or schizophrenia, all of which can occur in the pediatric population. There needs to be studies conducted, and FDA would require studies to be conducted to see whether or not those diseases those conditions in children would benefit from the same treatments as adults. That's true across all specialties, whether you're talking about arthritis, you're talking about types of cancer, the things like Crohn's disease and such. And it's worth noting that the goal of the PREA regulation or the PREA law and the perspective of FDA is, when a company pursues an indication, you're pursuing an indication for the entire population that has the disease, not just the adults that have the disease. And in fact, they're wanting to really change the paradigm, because I think in industry there's been this thinking, well, we're looking at the adult indication for whatever the condition is, and then we'll deal with the pediatric indication as a separate thing. I think increasingly the desire is to see those as one indication, one population. You know, if you're concerned about the adults with the condition, why aren't you concerned also about teens that are very soon going to be adults, and so forth? And so that's an important distinction. PREA is all about requirements, and so there is no incentive associated with it. And that's one of the reasons that FDA has been leaning towards using the BPCA incentive for other conditions that are unrelated to the original conditions that are studied in the adult population.
Thank you so much. All right, we're down to the last couple of minutes. Any other questions, comments?
Maybe if I may just add to that fantastic explanation that AJ gave, just to flag that there is a bill in Congress that, so right now, most orphan drugs are exempt from the PREA requirement, except for oncology drugs. And that bill would change that, in addition to increasing funding for BPCA, changing some of FDA's ability to enforce some of the pediatric requirements, and forcing FDA or instructing FDA to issue guidance on how exemptions from PREA would work, in particular for orphan drugs. So it's just something to flag for everyone.
Thank you for that. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to all of our wonderful speakers. It's always wonderful to hear from folks. So thank you, AJ, Maynard, Jamie, Karen, and all of you for being here. And we will see you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.